She walked into the store she secretly owned wearing nothing more than a hoodie and worn-out sneakers, only to be slapped across the face by the white store manager who called her a charity case. But what none of them knew was that the woman they just humiliated wasn't a nobody. She was the billionaire CEO of the entire company. And what happened next? It wasn't just justice, it was a reckoning. This is a story about ego, ignorance, and the quiet power of someone who never needed to raise her voice to change everything. So buckle up, because you won't believe what unfolds behind those polished glass doors. Let us know what time you're listening, and where you're tuning in from. Drop a comment below. There are moments in life that don't just happen, they stop time. They cut through the noise of the world like a blade through silk. And for everyone inside that high-end furniture boutique in Charleston, South Carolina, one of those moments had just arrived. It came not with warning, not with fanfare, but with a sharp, open-palmed slap that echoed off polished marble floors and bounced from chandelier to cash register. The sound seemed louder than it should have been, sharper than a slap had any right to be. For a moment it silenced the room, then silenced thought, and finally it silenced breath. Everyone turned. Standing at the center of the store's main showroom under the golden lighting designed to make luxury glow warmer were two women locked in a tableau of disbelief. One of them tall and pale, her strawberry blonde hair tied in a rigid bun, her voice always just a bit too loud, had her right hand frozen mid-air, still extended from the force of the blow. Her expression was a complex knot of authority, disdain, and a certain self-satisfaction, like someone who believed she had just fixed a problem no one else had the courage to address. Her name was Cynthia Blake. She was the store manager, and at this moment she looked like she had won something. The other woman stood still, not because she was stunned, not because she didn't know what to do, but because she had chosen not to move. Her skin was dark, warm like earth after rain, and her cheek now carried the fresh red imprint of a stranger's judgment. Her name was Selena Grant. She was 59, dressed simply in a light gray hoodie, a pair of faded jeans and sneakers, so old the laces had frayed. She didn't speak, didn't step back, didn't even touch her face right away. Instead, her eyes locked with Cynthia's, not in anger, not in fear, but in something quieter, something deeper, something that made Cynthia for the first time blink. The room hadn't quite caught up to what had just happened. Some shoppers stood frozen mid-step, a woman's hand still hovering over a vase, a man pausing with a measuring tape dangling from his fingers. A soft murmur began to ripple through the showroom, first as gasps, then as phone screens being unlocked, then as whispers turning into questions. But the center of it all remained still. Selena finally moved. She reached up slowly with the back of her left hand and wiped her cheek, not roughly, not with drama, but like brushing away an inconvenient raindrop. Then she looked down, exhaled once through her nose, and let her eyes scan the room faces, lights the wide glass windows, revealing a bright afternoon outside. When her gaze returned to Cynthia, it held a weight. Not rage, not humiliation, but calculation. Cynthia broke the silence first, her voice slightly breathless. "You need to leave. Right now. Before I call the police." Selena raised an eyebrow only slightly. "Is that your solution?" she said, her voice calm, steady low. "To violence. And then more threats." The question wasn't asked in defense. It wasn't even a challenge. It was an observation. But it hit Cynthia like accusation. "You don't belong here," Cynthia replied, eyes darting briefly toward the growing audience. "This isn't a community center or a discount mart. This is a prestige showroom, and we don't," she caught herself, but not fast enough. "We don't cater to browsers." Selena looked away for a second, then slowly turned her gaze to the walnut wood shelving unit beside her, then to the crystal sculpture display behind it, then back to Cynthia. "I see," she said simply. The tension now had shape. It moved through the air like smoke, visible but untouchable. It moved between people's shoulders, over the nerves of those who stood nearby and pretended to look away but didn't. The security guard, a stocky man in his 30s named Eddie, had stepped forward out of instinct, unsure if he was supposed to intervene or just stand at attention. One of the floor associates, a younger woman with curly hair named Tasha, stood with her mouth slightly open, as if she'd been holding her breath since the slap. Everyone was waiting for something to happen, some shift in power, some retaliation, something to release the unbearable stillness that had gripped them all. But Selena didn't give them what they were waiting for. She turned slightly, scanned the room once more, and then smiled. It wasn't a mocking smile. It wasn't one of amusement or forgiveness. It was the kind of smile that belongs to someone who's seen this all before. Someone who knows what's coming, who's already 2 moves ahead on a chessboard no one else knows exists. "Thank you for showing me exactly what kind of store this is," she said softly, and then turned and began walking toward the exit. Not rushed, not defeated, not humiliated, just done. As she walked, people stepped aside without realizing they had. One man awkwardly lowered his phone. A woman whispered, "Did she really just get slapped?" Someone else muttered, "Why didn't she say anything?" But Selina didn't turn back. The weight of the moment moved with her, not against her. Cynthia stood frozen. Her adrenaline had peaked and now began to fray at the edges. She felt the first prickles of doubt, though she didn't yet recognize them as such. Her hand still tingled from the slap. Her jaw was tight. She could hear whispers beginning to rise behind her, words she couldn't make out, but tones she didn't like. At the door, Selina paused. She placed her hand on the glass, pushed it open slowly, and stepped out into the afternoon light. The warmth of the sun kissed her face, and the noise of the city washed over her like a second atmosphere. Horns, footsteps, seagulls from the harbor not far away. The door closed behind her with a soft, airtight thud. She stood still for 1 moment more, then reached into the pocket of her hoodie, pulled out a slim phone and dialed. "Harper," she said as the line connected. "Activate code red. Store 26. Full protocol." She didn't need to explain. On the other end, Harper Lynn, a woman who had worked at Selina's side through mergers, lawsuits, and boardroom wars, answered with calm precision. "Understood. Legal, HR, and security. All of them," Selina replied. Then she paused. "And bring the ownership documents. I want them in hand." Harper's voice softened. "You okay?" Selina looked back at the store through the window. Inside, Cynthia was already moving toward the front, still riding the high of what she thought was a victory. She couldn't hear what Cynthia was saying now, but she could read the smugness in the woman's posture. Selina gave the faintest nod to no one in particular. "I will be." And then she ended the call, slipped the phone back in her pocket, and walked calmly to the edge of the sidewalk, her shadow trailing behind her like the last remnant of a storm that hadn't yet begun. 8 hours earlier, the same woman who had been slapped in front of a crowd walked quietly through the glass doors of the very store she owned. The morning sun cast long shadows across the parking lot, and as the automatic doors slid open with a soft hiss, Selina Grant stepped inside with the kind of quiet grace that came not from arrogance but from deep-lived wisdom. She wore a gray hoodie loose around the collar, a pair of gently faded jeans and sneakers, so well worn they had started to fray around the soles. Her posture was relaxed, shoulders, soft chin, slightly dipped, not out of shame but intention. She had learned long ago that invisibility when chosen could be a powerful thing. The store smelled like polished wood-fresh linen, and the faint trace of bergamot diffusers tucked discreetly near the shelves. Jazz hummed softly through overhead speakers, one of those curated playlists designed to make shoppers linger and spend without realizing they were being influenced. Around her clean displays of hand-carved coffee tables, Italian leather armchairs, and imported rugs lined up like actors waiting to impress. The showroom was immaculate, curated for the Charleston elite. Selina moved slowly, her fingertips occasionally grazing the edge of a marble side table or the embroidery of a throw pillow, her eyes taking in every detail, not as a buyer, but as a builder. To anyone watching, she looked like someone who didn't belong, not because she wasn't capable of appreciating beauty, but because she didn't wear it loudly. There was no designer handbag slung over her shoulder, no statement earrings, no fresh manicure or blowout. She had come as herself, deliberately unguarded, because what she was looking for couldn't be found in spreadsheets or quarterly reports. She was here to see the truth with her own eyes. Selina had received the first anonymous letter 3 weeks earlier. It was handwritten with shaky penmanship and no return address. It described subtle acts of exclusion, quiet comments made near customers who looked different, and employees of color who were given the worst shifts or silenced when they spoke up. A week later came a second letter, this time from a young black woman who had worked at the store for only a month before quitting. Her message was more direct. "There's something ugly behind the polish," she'd written. "You need to see it for yourself." Selina didn't respond to the letters. She didn't announce an inspection. She didn't alert corporate. She simply got into her 10-year-old silver Lexus, an old model she had refused to replace out of principle, and drove herself to Charleston. No entourage. No board member, no assistant, just her. As she walked further into the showroom, an older white woman in a beige suit glanced up from behind the counter. Her eyes flicked over Selena's clothes, paused for a breath, then dropped back to her computer without a word. No greeting, no offer of help, just dismissal, soft and sharp. Selena noticed it. She always noticed those small, instinctual rejections, the way they moved through a room like static electricity, invisible to most, but loud to those who had learned to survive them. She stopped at a walnut bookshelf near the center of the store and tilted her head, studying how the corner joints were sanded. A younger employee, maybe early 20s, passed by with a tray of fabric samples but didn't stop. Two other customers, both middle-aged white, dressed in crisp button-downs, walked by and exchanged a glance when they saw her. One of them chuckled under his breath. Selena heard it. She didn't react. Instead, she moved toward the back of the store, where the high-end pieces were kept. There was a linen chaise priced at over $8, and beside it a sculpted ceramic lamp she recognized from an Italian designer she had once met in Milan. Her hand hovered near the lamp's base, not to touch it, but to measure how dusty it was. It wasn't. Whoever maintained the floor was doing their job. A voice behind her interrupted the moment. "Can I help you find something?" It wasn't a question. It was a challenge disguised as courtesy. Selena turned and saw the store manager for the first time that day, Cynthia Blake. Impeccably dressed in a beige silk blouse, tucked into black slacks, her makeup flawless, her expression taut with the precision of someone who had practiced it in mirrors. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. Selena offered a polite nod. "No thank you. Just browsing." Cynthia's smile sharpened. "Of course. Just so you know, these pieces aren't part of a clearance or outlet inventory. This section is reserved for our premium clients." Selena blinked slowly. "Good to know." There was silence between them, not awkward, but electric. Cynthia hesitated for a moment, her eyes narrowing just slightly, trying to place this woman who didn't quite fit. Then she turned and walked away with a swish of her blazer, her heels clicking confidently across the tile. Selena watched her go. She took a deep breath, held it, and exhaled. This was why she had come. Not for furniture, not for numbers, but for this exact moment. The assumption, the performance, the polite degradation dressed as brand preservation. She had lived through it as a child, watching her mother get ignored in department stores. She had seen it again in college, wearing hand-me-downs among girls with designer wallets and credit lines. She had endured it early in her career, being talked over in meetings, misread, underestimated, passed by. But never erased, and she would not be erased today. Not here, not in her own store. Selena turned her attention to a stack of brochures near the register and picked one up. She flipped through it, pausing on the page that listed the company's founder. Grant Living Interiors was founded on a vision of inclusion, excellence, and timeless design. The mission statement stared back at her like a mirror, reflecting something deeply cracked. A young employee walked past again, this time glancing at her with curiosity rather than suspicion. He hesitated for half a second, as if about to ask if she needed help, but a look from Cynthia, now stationed near the main desk, stopped him in his tracks. Selena caught the exchange. She closed the brochure and set it back down gently. Outside, the sunlight had climbed higher, warming the wide sidewalk and the row of luxury cars parked along the curb. Inside, however, the temperature had dropped just enough to notice. Selena folded her hands in front of her, looked toward the ceiling speakers playing Miles Davis, and nodded once, almost to herself. She had seen enough, not of the store's layout or its inventory or its marketing execution, but of its soul. And something inside her, quiet and deep, began to rearrange. Not with anger, not even with urgency, but with certainty. She turned, made her way toward the rear corner, where the office hallway began, and disappeared from view. Behind her, the showroom carried on like nothing had happened. Cynthia Blake didn't just manage the store, she ruled it. From the moment she unlocked the front doors at 9:55 every morning to the precise way she aligned the brass placard that read Prestige Home, Charleston, everything inside those walls moved, breathed, and existed on her terms. She had worked here for 14 years, starting as a floor associate, fresh out of community college, and had clawed her way up through charm, performance, and sheer obsession with control. Nothing in her life outside this store brought her as much validation, and nothing outside these walls frightened her more. Each morning she walked the floor like a general inspecting her troops, heels clicking confidently across polished tile, her eyes scanning for fingerprints on glass, uneven product displays, or worse, people who didn't look like they belonged. She was 46, always perfectly groomed with her light red hair twisted into a sleek bun, her jaw always tight, her smile always measured. Her voice could be soft like velvet or sharp like broken porcelain depending on who you were and how much you spent. On the surface she was polished, professional, even charming to the right people. But underneath, there was a constant tension, a gnawing anxiety masked by lipstick and linen blouses. Cynthia had spent her whole life trying to prove that she belonged in a world that had always looked a little past her first, as a girl from a modest working-class home, then as a woman trying to rise in spaces where wealth whispered a coded language and judged you by your shoes before your resume. She had learned early that if she couldn't be born into power, she could at least imitate it, control it, enforce it. And this store was her stage. Everything about her management style reflected that tight, unspoken panic, this desperate need to maintain the illusion of exclusivity, even if it meant drawing harsh lines around who was welcome and who wasn't. Her staff knew the rules even when they weren't written down. They knew which customers got personal greetings and complimentary espresso, and which ones were silently followed from room to room. They understood that looking a certain way, neatly dressed, discreetly branded, unmistakably upper-middle class, wasn't just a preference here, it was policy. Gregory Parks, her assistant manager, was perhaps her most loyal foot soldier. In his early 40s, with a mild demeanor and neatly parted hair, Gregory rarely questioned Cynthia's decisions. He believed in the structure she created, the predictability of it, the safety of aligning with power. If she says no, it's no, he once whispered to a junior associate who had hesitated at denying service to a walk-in customer wearing a janitor's uniform. Gregory had never been cruel, but he had long ago chosen order over empathy. Then there was Eddie, the security guard, 35, ex-military, broad-shouldered, polite to customers, but trained to act on unspoken signals. Cynthia never had to say anything twice. A raised brow, a small nod, a glance toward the cameras. He understood the choreography. His job wasn't just to guard the merchandise. It was to maintain the environment Cynthia had built, the one where status could be read in silence. Cynthia's favorite part of the day was between noon and 3, when the wealthier regulars came in, the retired attorneys, the real estate developers, the socialites with husbands in maritime law. Among them was Doris Hampton, a 72-year-old widow with sharp perfume, a sharper tongue, and a standing monthly credit card balance that rivaled some people's yearly income. Doris liked to think of herself as an informal partner in store policy. She offered unsolicited commentary on what the right kind of people looked like, and Cynthia never corrected her. They sipped iced mint tea from glass tumblers and exchanged knowing glances when someone inappropriate entered the store. You can tell just by the shoes Doris had once whispered, her lips, barely moving eyes locked on a young black couple examining a set of brass floor lamps. Cynthia had simply smiled and adjusted the collar of her blouse. But while Cynthia's kingdom looked pristine on the outside, cracks were forming beneath, whispers from employees, subtle shifts in morale. Turnover had increased, though Cynthia explained it away as a commitment to high standards. Some employees kept their heads down, afraid of making the wrong move. Others left quietly, tired of the pressure to be gatekeepers instead of guides. None of it fazed Cynthia. She saw herself as the last line of defense, protecting the store's image like a mother bear guarding her cubs. What truly unnerved her wasn't complaints or HR audits. It was uncertainty. It was the possibility that someone might walk in who didn't match the expected mold yet somehow belonged anyway. That's why she loathed unannounced walk-ins, especially those dressed in what she called camouflage old hoodies, worn jeans, shoes that whispered practicality instead of wealth. People who challenged her radar. So when she first saw the woman in gray browsing the mid-century cabinet collection that morning, something in her immediately bristled. She couldn't explain it, not at first. There was nothing outwardly threatening. No disruption. Just a woman quietly observing the craftsmanship on a mahogany console table. But to Cynthia, it was a disturbance. A rift in the fabric she had so carefully pressed into place. She tapped her pen against the front desk and watched the woman for a full minute, eyes narrowing. "Gregory," she said without turning her head. "Do you know her?" He glanced up from the tablet where he had been logging inventory. "The woman in the hoodie," Cynthia nodded once. "No idea. Haven't seen her before." Cynthia exhaled, slow and shallow. "Let me handle it." That was always her line. Let me handle it, and no one ever challenged her on what exactly that meant. She smoothed her blouse, adjusted the cuffs of her sleeves, and walked slowly toward the woman, rehearsing the tone in her mind. Friendly but firm, professional but pointed. Enough to send a message without causing a scene. She had done this before. She knew how to make someone feel like they didn't belong without ever saying the words out loud. But what Cynthia couldn't see, what she never trained herself to see, was the quiet weight in the woman's shoulders, the unwavering steadiness in her eyes, the kind of calm that doesn't come from submission but from power. Real power. The kind that doesn't need to be announced. And so while Cynthia approached with the confidence of someone convinced she owned the room, she had no idea she was walking toward the very person who owned far more than the room. She was walking toward the end of her own illusion, toward the collapse of everything she thought she controlled, and she would never see it coming, not until it was already too late. It began as it often does, not with a word but with a glance, quick, calculated, and quietly cruel. Cynthia spotted her near the accent mirror section, studying the edges of a brass-trimmed oval, like she was evaluating something far beyond its decorative purpose. To anyone else, the scene might have looked unremarkable, a customer in casual clothing browsing thoughtfully, hands tucked loosely in the pockets of her gray hoodie. But to Cynthia, who had trained herself to notice not what people were doing but what they represented, this woman stood out like a stain on silk. She stood too confidently for someone dressed so simply, moved too calmly for someone unfamiliar with wealth, and carried herself not with defiance but with presence. And that presence was precisely what made Cynthia's instincts tense. The store had just entered its midday lull, when foot traffic dipped and the music seemed to play a little louder in the empty spaces. The soft murmur of jazz filtered through the air, brushing against the quiet rustle of fabric samples and the occasional ding of the front door sensor. Yet even in the stillness, Cynthia felt something shift. It wasn't loud, it wasn't even visible to most, but to her it was unmistakable. She set down her clipboard, smoothed the sleeve of her blouse, and whispered to Gregory without looking at him, "I'm going to need eyes on that woman." Gregory glanced up, then followed her line of sight. "She's not doing anything," he said quietly, more as a question than a statement. Cynthia didn't answer. Instead, she adjusted her posture, exhaled slowly, and began walking in the woman's direction with the poise of someone preparing for battle, disguised as customer service. As she approached, the air seemed to tighten between them, not because of anything said, but because of everything implied. She offered the kind of smile you only ever see on people who want something hidden beneath it. "Can I help you find something today?" she asked, her tone light but edged with expectation. The woman turned toward her eyes, warm but alert, like someone used to being spoken to with veiled suspicion. "No thank you," she replied evenly. "Just browsing." "Of course," Cynthia said, lingering just half a second too long, her gaze drifting from the woman's face to her shoes. "Just so you know, the antique mirror line is a little exclusive. We don't keep prices on the tags for a reason." The woman smiled faintly, not in embarrassment but in recognition of a game she'd seen played many times before. "Good to know," she said, simply, then turned her gaze back to the mirror, as if Cynthia's presence were no more disruptive than a breeze. Cynthia stood there for a moment longer than was polite, caught off guard by the woman's composure, before pivoting away and returning to the front desk, her heels striking the tile harder than usual. She didn't say anything right away, just tapped her manicured nails lightly against the counter as if waiting for her thoughts to catch up to her discomfort. When Gregory approached, she didn't look up. "She doesn't belong here," she murmured. He hesitated. "You sure? I mean, she hasn't done anything." Cynthia finally turned her face calm, but her voice sharper now. "You don't have to break a vase to be the wrong kind of customer. It's a vibe. And that woman, she's giving me all the wrong signals." In truth, what Cynthia felt wasn't a vibe, it was fear, though she would never call it that. It was the kind of low-humming threat that only people obsessed with control can detect. The fear that someone might walk into their carefully curated world and not ask for permission to belong. That someone might quietly expose just how fragile the whole illusion really was. Back on the sales floor, Selena continued browsing. Her movements were deliberate, unhurried. She took her time, observing the grain of a rosewood table, testing the softness of a leather cushion, making quiet mental notes. She didn't touch more than necessary, didn't ask questions, didn't seek attention. But somehow attention kept circling her. Not from everyone, some staff ignored her completely, their internal code guiding them elsewhere. But from those who followed Cynthia's lead, the tension was beginning to thicken. Eddie, the security guard, stood a little closer now to her section of the store, pretending to adjust a display sign. A young cashier glanced her way, then quickly looked down again, unsure whether she should be worried or just observant. Even Doris, who had just entered with a rustling of gold jewelry and an air of entitlement, paused when she spotted the woman by the dressers. "Who's that?" she whispered to Cynthia, who had been watching the scene unfold like a theater production. Cynthia lowered her voice to match. "Not sure. Walked in this morning, hasn't asked for anything. Been touching the high-ticket items, though." Doris smirked. "Well, let's hope she doesn't mistake this place for a charity showroom." They both chuckled softly, just enough to feel superior, not loud enough to draw attention. Selina heard them. She always did. Words, even when whispered, have a weight, and judgment, even when silent, has a shape. She let it sit for a moment, feeling the familiar ache of recognition. Not hurt, not even anger, just the knowledge that some people only feel safe when someone else is being excluded. She looked toward the cash wrap area, where Cynthia and Doris stood, their expressions veiled in practiced civility. Then she returned her eyes to the hand-carved dresser in front of her, running her fingers gently along the curve of its handle. It was a piece she had commissioned years ago for the flagship store in Chicago, one of her favorites actually, and yet here in this room it had been repurposed as a symbol of status instead of design, a wall instead of a bridge. She stepped away and wandered toward the fabric section, where velvet swatches were arranged in cascading palettes, each color carefully labeled with names that sounded more like poetry than paint: obsidian, bloom-fogged, plum, Tuscan, linen. She touched the edge of one swatch and closed her eyes briefly, remembering the first time she ever bought fabric she couldn't afford, just a quarter yard of silk, saved for and guarded like treasure. The memory settled on her chest, warm and full. From across the room, Cynthia watched her closely now. Every movement became a message. Every pause became suspect. The woman wasn't behaving like someone who felt out of place, and that made her dangerous. "She's not just browsing," Cynthia said flatly, her arms folded now. "What do you think she's doing?" Gregory asked, his voice still tentative. Cynthia's eyes narrowed. "Testing boundaries. Seeing how far she can go before we stop her." She didn't know why she felt that way, only that the feeling wouldn't go away, and that in her world was reason enough to act. Selina turned one last time to take in the room, the clean displays, the muted colors, the glances she had gathered like dust. Then, without a word, she walked slowly toward the front of the store. And in that moment, though, no alarm sounded, no lines were crossed, and no confrontation occurred. The lines between who belonged and who decided had never been more visible, and Cynthia Blake had made her decision. Selina didn't realize how quiet the store had become until she noticed her own footsteps echoing gently against the smooth tile floor. The jazz that had hummed softly in the background earlier now felt distant, like it belonged to a different place, entirely, as if the air itself had shifted in tone and temperature. She stood near the glass jewelry case, her eyes following the subtle arrangement of sterling silver and delicate gold, admiring the craftsmanship with the quiet appreciation of someone who understood the value of restraint. Her hands were folded calmly in front of her, her weight balanced evenly, her expression composed. She had done nothing more than look, never touched, never requested, never intruded, and yet she could feel the gaze on her back like a change in weather. Cynthia had returned this time without the veil of politeness she wore earlier. Her heels clicked more sharply than before, her jaw set slightly tighter, her lips pressed into a smile that didn't bother pretending to be warm. She approached like a prosecutor rather than a store manager, armed with the certainty of someone who believed they had the full support of the room. "Is there something specific you're looking for?" she asked, her voice louder than it needed to be, just enough to make heads turn from across the showroom. Selina turned slowly and met her eyes. "Just browsing," she replied with the same gentle evenness she had used earlier. She wasn't shaken, but she was aware of the sudden silence around her, aware of the stares beginning to accumulate like static in the corners. Cynthia glanced down at the jewelry case, then back at Selina. "That bracelet right there," she said with a dry chuckle, "costs more than most people pay in rent for 6 months. Just wanted to make sure you're aware." Selina didn't respond. She merely looked at the bracelet, then back at Cynthia, and nodded once, as if to say "message received," and dismissed. The air thickened. A few customers had begun to linger near the periphery of the room, pretending to be interested in a bookshelf or a lamp, while keeping their attention firmly planted on the growing tension near the jewelry. One man in a tailored blazer leaned subtly on a display table, sipping his espresso with too much interest. A woman in cream-colored heels nudged her friend and tilted her head toward the scene, eyebrows raised. Cynthia, emboldened by the attention, stepped slightly closer. She continued now, addressing no one and everyone all at once. "We try to be accommodating, but there's a certain expectation in this part of the store. This is curated for clients who understand value, who, how shall I say, have a certain taste and track record." Selina tilted her head. "And how exactly do you measure that? The track record, I mean." Cynthia's smile widened, though her eyes remained cold. "It's a combination of things. Presentation, familiarity, intent. People who shop here usually don't hesitate. They know what they're after." A few chuckles rippled quietly through the watching customers, low and complicit. Selina took a step back from the case and folded her arms, not defensively but as if bracing herself against a wind that hadn't even fully blown in yet. Behind the register, Amber, the youngest cashier, barely 24, was watching with the wide-eyed curiosity of someone witnessing something they knew was wrong but hadn't yet found the courage to say it aloud. Her hands hovered uncertainly over the drawer as she pretended to check inventory. She glanced nervously at Maria, who stood frozen nearby, her lips slightly parted, her fingers wringing the edge of her blouse. Then Cynthia raised her voice just enough for the moment to tilt into performance. "Attention, everyone," she said, with a mock playful tone, waving one hand toward the crowd that had now clearly formed. "We have someone interested in trying on our $4 designer dress. Isn't that adorable?" The room froze. Even the music seemed to pause, as if uncertain whether it was still welcome. Every head turned. Phones were subtly raised. A few customers laughed quietly. One older man shook his head and muttered, "She's brave, I'll give her that." Selina didn't move. She simply blinked once and stood beneath the weight of their eyes, her stillness louder than any retort. She knew this moment, not this store, not this crowd, but this exact dynamic. She had seen it in college dining halls, in boardrooms, where her voice was the only one not acknowledged, in restaurants where she was mistaken for staff. It never changed, only the backdrop did. Cynthia, now fully leaning into the spectacle, laughed once, short and sharp. "Maybe we should run a credit check before she touches the fabric. We have policies, after all." Someone near the entrance let out a whistle. A young woman giggled and whispered, "This is wild," to the man beside her. Selina's eyes scanned the room slowly, taking in every face. She wasn't angry. She was watching, committing to memory, the faces of those who found amusement in degradation. Doris Hampton stepped forward now, smiling tightly, her pearl necklace resting neatly against her silk blouse. "Honey," she said with sugar-laced cruelty, "there are plenty of wonderful places in town with more suitable pricing. Don't you think you're in the wrong place?" Selina turned toward her. "That depends," she said softly. "Are we pricing the furniture or the people?" Doris laughed. "Oh dear, it's not personal." "It never is," Selina murmured, her voice steady, not rising, not trembling. "Until it is." But even her calm wasn't enough to halt the next wave. Cynthia stepped forward and gestured to the security guard, who had now positioned himself just behind the display counter. "Ma'am, if you continue making other guests uncomfortable, we may need to ask you to leave." Selina raised an eyebrow. "Have I said anything inappropriate?" "You're creating a disruption," Cynthia replied flatly. "This is a professional retail space, and we reserve the right to maintain our standards." It wasn't just an accusation. It was an invitation for the crowd to agree. And they did, some with nods, some with quiet mutters, others with silence thick enough to signal alignment. Selina turned back to the bracelet and took a final look, not because she wanted it, but because it reminded her of how far she had come, not in dollars, not in stature, but in knowing her worth. In knowing that power didn't always roar, it could also stand still and listen. Then she met Cynthia's eyes one last time. "You've made your point," she said calmly. "I'll remember it." And with that she walked away slowly, gracefully, past the eyes that had judged her, past the lips that had laughed at her, past the hands that hadn't offered help. At the exit she paused. Her hand touched the cool glass of the door, and for a moment her reflection stared back at her, composed, grounded, and utterly unchanged by the theater behind her. She stepped into the daylight and left the show behind. Outside the store, the afternoon sun had climbed higher, softening the sharp lines of passing cars and casting a quiet warmth across the pavement. The door slid shut behind Selina, with a soft hiss separating her from the thick, judgmental air of the showroom, replacing it with something steadier, something cleaner. She paused just outside the glass, not to look back, but to breathe. One hand gently touched her cheek, not because it hurt, though it did, but because her body needed a moment to process what her mind already knew. The slap, the mockery, the glances, the laughter, none of it was new. But even after all these years, it never fully stopped taking something from you. She stood still, her posture calm but purposeful, as if the sidewalk were her boardroom, and the next steps had already been decided. She didn't tremble. She didn't rage. She simply reached into her hoodie pocket, pulled out her phone, and tapped the name she had memorized for moments just like this. The line rang once, maybe twice, before a familiar voice picked up precise alert, already in motion. "Yes, miss?" "Grant Harper," she said quietly, her voice, "Even I need you to activate Code Red. Store 26. Full response." There was no hesitation on the other end, just a short, efficient reply. "Understood. Legal, HR, and security, all of them. And bring the documents. I want the original purchase contract, today's date and timestamp." Harper didn't ask what had happened. She never did. 8 years of service had taught her that when Selina called with that, tone details were secondary to execution. But this time she hesitated just briefly. "Are you okay, Selina?" Let her eyes rest on the reflection of the store window. Through the glass, she could see Cynthia smiling, laughing, even her hands animated as she retold the moment of victory to a cluster of customers still high on group cruelty. Somewhere behind her, someone opened a bottle of champagne. "I will be," Selina said, and ended the call. She didn't move right away. She stood there a moment longer, watching the silhouettes inside the store shift and blur behind the sunlit glass. Her own reflection looked back at her, not like a victim, not even like a witness, but like a mirror that had just seen everything and chosen to remember all of it. Back inside, the air had turned celebratory. Cynthia was glowing in a way that only people intoxicated with their own righteousness can. Her cheeks were flushed, her smile wide, her voice higher than usual. She raised a glass of chilled Dom Perignon, one she had retrieved herself from the manager's office fridge reserved for special days, and held it up like a symbol of conquest. "To standards," she said brightly, "and to protecting the image of what we've built here." A few customers clapped lightly. Doris added, "And to knowing when to draw the line." Even Amber, the youngest among the employees, lifted her glass, though her fingers trembled slightly as they curled around the stem. The mood was buoyant, casual, the kind of artificial ease that only appears when people are desperate to convince themselves they've done the right thing. But not everyone was fooled. Maria stood by the register quietly, watching the celebration unfold. Her arms were crossed, not out of comfort, but because it was the only way she could keep her hands from shaking. She had seen Selina's face up close, had heard the restraint in her voice, had felt the wrongness of it all in her gut, but still said nothing. Because she had a child at home, because rent was due next week, because this job was the only thing keeping her from drowning. She turned to Amber and whispered, "Do you think we went too far?" Amber didn't answer at first. She was still watching Cynthia laugh with Helen Carter, the longtime customer who had compared Selina to a charity case. "I don't know," she said finally. "Miss Anderson was amazing, right? I mean, she handled it perfectly." Maria didn't nod. She didn't argue either. She just looked down at the countertop, then at her own reflection in the glass, then at the door. At that moment, Cynthia leaned against the front desk, swirling her champagne lazily. "I mean, really," she said, "did you see her face? She actually thought she could try on that dress." She laughed again, louder this time. "I swear people like that, they see things on social media and think they can just walk into our world." "And she did," someone chimed in. "But not anymore," Cynthia finished, smiling smugly. Eddie, the security guard, stood nearby, arms folded across his chest. He hadn't spoken during the confrontation, hadn't needed to. His role was simple: stand watch, enforce if needed. But now he found himself watching the celebration with an odd detachment, as if realizing a line had been crossed but unsure when it had happened. He didn't move, didn't speak, just shifted his weight and stared at the empty floor where Selena had stood. Out in the parking lot, Selena stepped away from the door and walked slowly toward the shade of a small tree near the edge of the lot. She didn't need to wait inside to be present. The waiting was strategic. She wanted them to feel safe, uninterrupted, comfortable in their ignorance for just a little longer. Every minute they spent laughing was another minute they didn't realize the reckoning had already begun. She looked up at the sky, clear, quiet, indifferent, and thought about how many times she had been mistaken for someone less than what she was. Not just today, not just in this store, but across decades of boardrooms, lobbies, elevators, airports, hotel check-ins, and polite dismissals that always sounded like, "Ma'am, are you sure you're in the right place?" And she always had been. It was the world that was often wrong. A breeze passed gently through the lot, rustling a few leaves overhead, brushing against her hoodie. In that moment, her phone vibrated softly in her pocket. A text from Harper ETA, 22 minutes, 3 vehicles. Full team, legal team assembling now. Selena read it, nodded once to herself, and locked the screen. She wasn't angry, not in the way people often assumed. She didn't need anger to move forward. What she needed was clarity. And she had it now. The store had revealed itself completely, not just in its policy or its people, but in the ease with which cruelty became entertainment, in the eagerness with which strangers abandoned their dignity for a seat at someone else's hierarchy. And now they would learn the cost. She turned back toward the store and stood in the same spot where she had been dismissed less than 30 minutes earlier, this time with a different kind of stillness, one that came not from restraint but from control. Behind the glass they were still toasting, but outside the storm had already started. It started with a sound no one paid attention to at first, a low hum in the distance like any other vehicle passing down the main road. Then came the subtle squeak of tires turning into the parking lot, precise and unhurried, followed by the solid click of car doors opening in near-perfect unison. From the wide front windows of the showroom, all tinted just enough to blur the outside world into a sheen of color and motion, you could see 3 black SUVs pulling up to the curb. Nothing about them was flashy, no logos, no vanity plates, no sirens or spotlights, just polished steel and tinted glass, with quiet, unmistakable purpose. Inside the store, the mood had relaxed into smug celebration. The music was back to soft jazz, glasses still clinked faintly, and Cynthia had just launched into yet another retelling of what she described as her little stand for standards. She gestured grandly, champagne in one hand, her other sweeping through the air as if recounting a scene from a film in which she played both heroine and director. No one interrupted her, not Gregory, who stood dutifully by the display desk, nor Amber and Maria, who busied themselves resetting already perfect shelves. The customers lingered too, some sipping, others shopping again, basking in the atmosphere like guests at a private club where membership had just been reaffirmed. Honestly, Cynthia was saying it's refreshing to see people support a manager doing the right thing. I didn't ask for applause, but she chuckled, eyes flicking toward Helen Carter, who smiled back over her oversized sunglasses. It's nice when your values are noticed. No one saw the first set of doors open. No one noticed the first 2 figures walking in dressed in professional black holding tablets and manila folders, their eyes scanning the room with a quiet efficiency that didn't need to introduce itself. Then came a third, a woman in her 50s, calm, elegant, composed in navy blue, with a corporate badge clipped to her coat pocket that read, Rachel Stone, HR Director, Prestige Living Interiors. Her gaze moved methodically from one end of the showroom to the other, pausing briefly on the champagne flutes, the decorative tray, the wide smile. "Excuse me," she said, her voice firm but low, like someone used to being obeyed without raising it. "I'm looking for the store manager." Cynthia turned still, holding her glass, blinking as if the sudden shift in tone hadn't registered fully. "Yes," she said, walking over with a confident smile. "I'm Cynthia Blake. I run this location." "Can I help you with something?" Rachel extended a hand, not to shake, but as an official pause in motion. "We need to speak. Right now." "Do you have a private space?" Cynthia's eyebrows lifted just slightly more in curiosity than concern. She gestured toward her office. "Of course. If this is about the earlier situation, I assure you I handled it with full discretion." In fact, it's not just about that, Rachel interrupted, her voice, never losing composure. We're here as part of a broader internal review. Legal will join us in 5 minutes. Cynthia's confidence flickered just for a second. Legal, she repeated. What exactly is? Before she could finish, 2 more individuals entered. One man mid-40s in a tailored charcoal suit with a corporate security badge on his belt. The other, a younger woman with a messenger bag and a stack of documents under her arm. The air inside the store changed immediately, not with panic but with a sense of something real, arriving, something final. Gregory stepped forward, voice uncertain. Is something wrong? Rachel turned slightly. We'll be speaking with all senior staff shortly. Please remain available. Customers had begun to take notice now. A few of them stepped back from their conversations, eyeing the newcomers with subtle unease. Doris, sensing a shift in energy she couldn't name, whispered to Cynthia. Do you know what this is about? I'm sure it's procedural, Cynthia said quickly, setting down her glass, her voice just slightly tighter than before. Probably part of a new corporate policy rollout. Nothing serious, but she was already starting to feel the pressure creep into her spine. Rachel and her team disappeared into the office. Outside, a final SUV pulled up to the far end of the lot. The passenger door opened, and a woman stepped out. Not hurried, not flustered, but calm, in a way that suggested time itself would wait for her to speak. Selina Grant stood in the sunlight for a long, still moment. She adjusted her collar, exhaled once, then began walking toward the entrance with slow, deliberate steps. Each stride seemed to say, I belong wherever I walk. Amber saw her first through the window and froze. Maria followed her line of sight, her breath catching softly. Even Eddie, the security guard who had stood all morning with arms folded and eyes forward, shifted his weight and lowered his head just slightly, not out of shame but something close to it. Selina didn't acknowledge them. She walked straight to the front desk, where Cynthia, now visibly stiff, turned in slow disbelief. What? What are you doing here? Cynthia asked, the words dry on her tongue. Rachel emerged from the office just in time to hear the question. She stepped forward with quiet authority. Miss Blake, she said evenly, I'd like to formally introduce you to Selina Grant, founder, majority owner, and CEO of Prestige Living Interiors. The entire showroom fell into silence. The kind of silence that doesn't just land, it drops like a verdict. Faces paled. Glasses were set down. Conversations died mid-sentence. Cynthia didn't move. Her mouth opened just slightly, but no sound came out. Her eyes scanned Selina's face, searching for the mistake, for the impossibility, for the flaw in the story she had just celebrated an hour ago. But the flaw wasn't in the story. It was in the assumption. Selina turned toward her slowly, voice calm and clear. I'm here to observe how this brand treats people. So far, I'm deeply disappointed. No one clapped now. No one toasted. And Cynthia, for the first time in years, had nothing to say. Selina didn't raise her voice. She didn't point, didn't accuse, didn't scold. She simply stood there in her quiet truth, the embodiment of everything they thought she could never be. And in that moment the balance shifted, not with fury but with gravity. And gravity never asks permission before it pulls everything down. There's a kind of silence that doesn't come from the absence of sound, it comes from the shattering of certainty. That's what filled the air the moment Rachel Stone, composed and steady, turned to the crowd of employees and guests and said clearly, without raising her voice, Everyone, I'd like you to meet Miss Selina Grant, founder, CEO, and sole owner of Prestige Living Interiors. The words didn't echo because they didn't need to. They landed with the weight of stone dropped into water, sending slow, rippling waves across every person in the showroom. For a moment, no one moved. Cynthia Blake's face was frozen in the same polite smile she had worn seconds earlier, but her eyes had gone flat, her pupils tight with disbelief. Her mouth opened slightly, like her body was trying to respond before her mind could form the sentence. That's not possible, she muttered, just loud enough for those closest to hear. She came in off the street. Selina didn't blink. She didn't smirk. She didn't posture or demand apology. She simply looked at Cynthia with the calmness of someone who had already forgiven the slap but hadn't forgotten what it revealed. Cynthia tried again, a nervous laugh escaping her lips this time. Wait, you mean this woman is… her? I mean, she gestured awkwardly, first at Selina's hoodie, then toward the office. She doesn't look like… Like what? Selina asked gently, the first words she had spoken since stepping back inside. That question, just 2 syllables, hung in the air with such quiet gravity that even Doris, standing stiffly near the chaise lounge, lowered her gaze to the floor. No one answered, no one dared. Rachel glanced at her tablet, then back at Cynthia. "We've reviewed the security footage from earlier today," she said plainly. "Every interaction, every comment, every escalation. We have the entire timeline from Miss Grant entering the store to the moment she was physically assaulted." Gregory's throat tightened. He opened his mouth to speak, but only a thin breath came out. Amber, still standing behind the counter, suddenly looked 10 years younger, her hands trembling, her eyes wide, her face pale. I didn't know," she whispered. "She said she was just a—" "She said nothing," Rachel cut in, not cruelly but firmly, "and no one asked." Maria, who had stood quietly by the register during the celebration earlier, finally stepped forward, her voice barely more than a breath. "Miss Grant, I'm so sorry. I knew something wasn't right, but I was afraid to speak." Selina nodded once, her eyes softening, not out of pity, but in recognition. "Fear can be powerful," she said quietly, "but silence, when it joins power, becomes something else entirely." Cynthia still hadn't sat down. Her legs were stiff, her fingers cold, but her pride wouldn't let her move. She looked around the room at the staff who had followed her lead, the customers who had applauded her speech, the management team now taking quiet notes along the wall. All the certainty she had built her authority on, every rule she had created, every boundary she had enforced, was now cracking beneath the truth that stood calmly in front of her. Rachel stepped forward. "Miss Blake, based on today's incident, your employment with Prestige Living Interiors is officially terminated. Effective immediately." Cynthia blinked hard. "Terminated," she repeated, almost in disbelief. "No warning, no review. You can't just—" "We can," Rachel replied evenly. "And we are." Eddie, the security guard, shifted uncomfortably in the corner, now uncertain whether to intervene or stand down. Maria reached over and gently removed Cynthia's name badge from her chest, not with malice, but with the quiet professionalism of someone carrying out a decision they no longer had the power to avoid. Selina turned toward the rest of the room. For the past 8 hours she began, her voice low, and even you've all participated in something that didn't begin with a slap. It began with a look, a judgment, a decision to believe that someone's appearance could tell you everything you needed to know about their worth. No one interrupted her. She continued, "You chose cruelty when kindness would have cost you nothing. You chose assumption over inquiry. You chose exclusion over dignity. And for that there are consequences." There was no anger in her voice, just clarity, just truth. She reached into the pocket of her coat and pulled out her phone, tapping twice to bring up a file. Then she held it out, showing footage captured from her point of view, recorded earlier that day. The slap, the laughter, the bracelet joke, the Target comment, Cynthia's mocking smile, the credit check threat. Every moment was there, crystal clear, playing back in real time for everyone to see. Helen Carter gasped and took a step back, her hand flying to her mouth. "Oh dear God," she whispered. "We didn't know. You didn't ask," Selina replied softly. Across the room, 2 customers began slowly gathering their bags, heads down, moving toward the exit like guests leaving a party they no longer wanted to be part of. Tyler Brooks, who had stood silent through much of the confrontation earlier, now stepped forward, his voice shaking. "Miss Grant, I apologize. Truly. I thought I was supporting store policy, but I see now it was something else." "Policy," Selina said gently, "is only as good as the people who enforce it." She turned to Rachel and nodded. "File the incident report. Update our internal conduct training. I want full retraining at every store location within the next 60 days. "Yes, ma'am," Rachel said. "And make the footage public," Selina added. "Unedited." There was a stunned pause, and then Rachel nodded again, more firmly this time. "Understood." Selina looked around the showroom one last time. It was still beautiful, polished wood, curated lighting designer pieces imported from around the world. But now, it looked different. Not because anything had changed visually, but because the illusion of safety, the unspoken performance of civility, had been stripped away. As she moved toward the door, the crowd parted not out of fear, but in quiet recognition. No one reached for her. No one stopped her. They simply watched as she walked through the same glass doors they had once asked her to leave through, not with shame, not with apology, but with complete unshakable control. Outside, the late afternoon sun was beginning to soften again, casting long shadows across the sidewalk, catching the edge of her coat as she stepped into the light. She didn't look back. She didn't need to, because sometimes power doesn't come from what you say. It comes from what you choose to walk away from, and who's still standing behind when you do. There are moments when justice doesn't knock politely, it walks in without waiting to be invited, carrying the weight of truth like a hammer. That's what it felt like in the hours that followed Selena's quiet declaration and Rachel Stone's swift, unwavering decisions. The store that had been full of smug laughter, clinking champagne glasses, and quiet cruelty just hours earlier now stood frozen in the thick air of consequence. People didn't speak as much as they shifted nervously, awkwardly, unconsciously trying to shrink the space they occupied as if guilt took up physical room. Maria Gonzalez stood behind the register, her fingers curled tightly around a damp cloth she wasn't using anymore. Her gaze kept drifting toward the center of the room, where Cynthia's name badge now sat face down on the front desk, as if it too had been stripped of its authority. Amber was wiping display glass again for the third time, her motions slower, less certain, as if trying to clean something that no longer had anything to do with fingerprints. Cynthia had already been escorted out of the store by internal security, not through the back like she had once threatened others with, but through the front entrance in full view of every employee and customer still standing there. She didn't resist. She didn't scream or argue. She walked stiffly, hands clenched at her sides, her expression unreadable, as if her mind had gone quiet the moment she saw Selena standing beside Rachel. Selena didn't speak during the removal. She didn't look away either. She stood with the same calm, still strength she had carried since the moment she walked through the door. Her presence wasn't theatrical, it was grounded. Not meant to punish, but to remind everyone watching what real power looked like when it chose to be still. Rachel said gently but firmly, "You'll be suspended for the next 2 weeks, pending a full review. You'll be asked to attend mandatory training on workplace ethics, customer profiling, and bias response." Gregory nodded, his voice a whisper. "Yes, ma'am." He didn't argue. He didn't ask for a second chance. Deep down, he knew this was merciful. He had stood by Cynthia far too long, not because he hated the people she targeted, but because he was afraid of being next. His loyalty had always been to stability, not to justice. Rachel continued, clipboard in hand, her voice unwavering. "Maria Gonzalez, your employment is terminated effective immediately. You participated in the humiliation of Miss Grant and failed to report misconduct despite witnessing multiple incidents." Maria's eyes welled with tears, but she didn't plead. She looked at Selena with an expression of quiet heartbreak and regret. "I'm sorry," she said. "Truly, I was scared. I needed the paycheck." Selena nodded once, not as forgiveness, but as recognition. "I understand fear," she replied, "but it doesn't excuse cruelty." Amber Davis was next. She looked like she might collapse where she stood, her entire body trembling as if her guilt had nowhere else to go. "Please," she said through tears, "I thought it was just policy. I thought Cynthia was protecting the brand. I didn't know who you were." "You didn't need to know who I was," Selena replied calmly. "You only needed to know what respect looked like." Rachel gave the final verdict. "Terminated. Effective immediately. You may gather your things." Amber nodded, sobbing now, her hand covering her mouth. She didn't move right away. She stood frozen, holding the silence like a punishment in itself. Helen Carter, the longtime customer who had been at the center of Cynthia's cruelty, attempted to approach Selena Pearls, bouncing slightly with each step. "Miss Grant," she began, voice unusually soft, "I deeply regret my words earlier. I was out of line." Selena didn't flinch, didn't step back. She looked Helen directly in the eyes. "You weren't out of line," she said. "You drew the line." Helen looked away, ashamed. "You're no longer welcome in this store," Selena added, "or in any prestige living showroom across the country. Your profile has been removed from our loyalty system, effective immediately." Helen didn't argue. She turned and walked toward the exit, her steps no longer brisk, her pride suddenly too heavy to carry. Around the store, the atmosphere had changed completely. No one dared whisper. No one dared shift blame. The mirrors reflected everyone back to themselves, stripped of illusion, raw and real. Justice had come not loud and brutal but deliberate and clear-eyed, and it hadn't needed to raise its voice to be felt in every corner. Selina walked slowly to the center of the floor. She didn't climb a podium. She didn't ask for silence. She simply began to speak. "Some of you might be wondering why I came here like this, dressed plainly unannounced without cameras or entourage," she said. "And the truth is, I've been this woman before. Not the CEO, not the owner, just a woman in a store seen as a disruption. I've stood in places like this all my life, watching people decide who they think I am before I ever say a word. No one moved," she continued. "This store was never supposed to be about status. It was meant to be about beauty, about dignity, about home. And what happened today, what all of you participated in or allowed, has broken something important." Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "But here's the thing about things that break," she said softly. "They can either be discarded or rebuilt stronger." She turned to Rachel. "Suspend operations. Close the store for 2 weeks. Full internal audit. No public statement yet. We'll let the footage speak for itself." "Yes, ma'am," Rachel replied without hesitation. Selina turned to leave, then paused near the display table, one she had designed herself years ago during the early days of her company. She ran her hand across the grain, felt the texture of the polished wood, remembered where she came from, and then quietly she said, "We're going to rebuild it, but this time we start with truth." With that, she stepped out of the store once more, not as someone dismissed but as the one who had returned to set things right. The sun had begun to dip lower in the sky, casting a soft golden haze across the pavement. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. Because real justice doesn't come for revenge. It comes for clarity, and it leaves the door open for those who are ready to change. When the doors of the Charleston showroom finally closed for the evening, it wasn't with a jingle of bells or the tired hum of routine. It was with a quiet thud like the closing of a chapter that had stayed open far too long. The last employee stepped out with her tote pressed against her side, eyes lowered, keys jingling faintly as she locked the entrance behind her. Inside, the lights dimmed slowly to their overnight setting, leaving the rows of furniture bathed in soft amber, a still life of elegance, beauty, and now reckoning. Selina remained inside alone for a moment longer. She stood near the center of the showroom floor. Her arms loosely folded the air around her, quiet but thick with memory. The polished wood under her shoes, the gentle perfume of citrus and cedar from a reed diffuser, the distant hum of the store's HVAC, it was all still the same. But the silence was different now. It was no longer the silence of tension. It was the silence of something that had been seen, acknowledged, and named. She walked slowly through the aisles, her fingertips grazing the back of a suede chair, the edge of a marble-top coffee table, the armrest of a sofa she had personally approved 2 seasons ago. These were not just objects to her. They were stories, designs that once passed through her sketchbooks, meetings, and late-night calls, each piece born from a philosophy she had lived by since she was young, that beauty and dignity should never be reserved for the few. But somewhere along the way that philosophy had been diluted, distorted into something else by people who had used her brand as a shield for their own prejudice. The thought didn't make her angry now. It made her sad, because this store was supposed to be a reflection of her, and what it had reflected today was something she could no longer ignore. She turned toward the back office where Rachel and the internal team were still gathering statements and logging the footage, making sure every word, every decision, every policy breach was documented with care. They would stay late. They always did. But Selina didn't follow them in. She didn't need to. She trusted them. Instead, she moved toward the customer lounge near the windows, an area she had designed to feel more like a living room than a showroom corner. She sat down in one of the cream-colored armchairs, adjusted the throw pillow behind her back, and looked out the window. The street outside was quiet now, traffic thinning as dusk settled.